I am about to reveal the greatest secret of ancient Rome. The mighty Roman Empire did not fall under the blows of barbarian swords. It collapsed under the weight of its own vices, eaten away from within. We are accustomed to thinking of the fall of Rome as a great battle, but the truth is much more prosaic and terrifying. It was a slow agony that lasted for centuries. The empire was destroyed by invisible enemies. Systemic corruption, economic collapse, and betrayal at the highest levels. The huge state machinery simply stopped working, leaving behind an empty shell. Watch the video to the end to find out how the most powerful empire in human history consumed itself, and why its citizens didn't even notice when it all ended. What if I told you that everything you believed about the fall of Rome is not true? We are shown images of a burning city and wild hordes, but this is only the finale of a long illness. The real catastrophe took place in the silence of offices and on empty fields. The fall of Rome was not a single event, like the storming of the Bastille. It was a process of dry rot that undermined the foundations of the state from within. When the walls came down, there was nothing left inside. Imagine a huge old tree with a mighty trunk. From the outside, it looks indestructible, but inside it has long been eaten away by termites. This is exactly what happened to the Roman Empire. We focus on the year 476 AD, but this is only a formal date. On that day, the Germanic leader Odoacer simply sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople. He did not even bother to appoint a new puppet emperor, because there was no point in doing so. The empire in the West had effectively ceased to exist long before that. The emperor's power did not extend beyond the suburbs of Rome. The provinces had long been living their own lives, fighting off raids or negotiating with them. This scenario is not about external enemies, but internal demons. We will talk about how Rome destroyed itself. Corruption, famine, and traitors proved to be more terrible than any enemy legion. The real collapse was not military, but systemic. The economy collapsed, social ties were destroyed. The administrative apparatus, which was Rome's main achievement, ceased to function. People simply stopped believing in the empire. They saw no point in defending it. For many peasants and townspeople, the arrival of the barbarians meant only a change of master and sometimes a reduction in the tax burden. This invisible erosion of power was the real fall of Rome. All the barbarians had to do was push what was already ready to collapse. I'm really interested to hear your point of view. Do you think it was possible to save the empire, or was the process irreversible? Write about it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Are you ready to learn the truth about how the army went from being Rome's defender to its chief gravedigger? In the 3rd century, the empire plunged into chaos, which historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. It was a parade of barracks emperors. This period was a real agony for the once powerful empire. Power in Rome was seized by military leaders who relied solely on the brute force of their legions. Stability gave way to anarchy, and the law gave way to the sword. It all began when the legions realized their power. After decades of civil wars and military coups, the soldiers finally understood a simple truth. They were the ones who decided who would sit on the throne. Their former loyalty to the Senate and the people of Rome evaporated. Soldiers ceased to be defenders of the state and became the main political force, the true makers of kings. They were interested only in their own benefit and pay. Any successful commander who won a victory on the border could be proclaimed emperor by his soldiers. The legionaries lifted him up on their shields, swore allegiance to him, and demanded that he lead them to the capital. It was a direct path to power. Instead of defending the borders from the barbarians, the new pretender led his legions not against the enemy, but against Rome. He waged war against the reigning emperor, who, in turn, gathered his loyal troops. This gave rise to an endless series of devastating civil wars. This era went down in history as the time of the soldier emperors. Over 50 years, from 235 to 284, more than 20 recognized emperors succeeded each other on the throne, not counting dozens of usurpers. Almost all of them were proclaimed by the army in the provinces. The life of such a ruler was short and dangerous. As soon as he could no longer satisfy the demands of the legions, death awaited him. Almost all of them were killed by their own soldiers, who immediately chose a new, more generous commander. The state could not function normally under such conditions. The constant change of power paralyzed the administration of the empire. No one could make long-term plans because tomorrow a new usurper could appear. All resources were spent on internal strife and maintaining bloated armies. While the legions fought each other in Italy or Gaul, the borders were left unguarded. External enemies immediately took advantage of this, invading Roman territory. In order to retain power for at least a few years, each new emperor had to appease the soldiers. Immediately after his proclamation, he promised the legions huge gifts, donativa. This was, in essence, a payment for loyalty. In addition to one-time payments, emperors constantly increased regular salaries. The army demanded more and more, and it was impossible to refuse. This military blackmail placed an unbearable burden on the economy. The money had to come from somewhere, but taxes no longer covered the expenses. Then the emperors found what they thought was a simple solution. They began to debase the currency by reducing the precious metal content of coins. More and more copper was added to the silver denarius, the empire's main coin. Soon it became practically a copper coin, only slightly coated with silver. The market responded with monstrous inflation, which we will discuss in the next chapter. Thus, the army went from being an instrument of defense to a veritable internal racketeer. It no longer protected citizens. It robbed them at the hands of the emperor. Soldiers demanded more and more money for their loyalty. Any threat to depose the emperor was real, and everyone knew it. It was a vicious circle. To pay the army, the emperor ruined the provinces. Ruin led to riots, and to suppress the riots, the army was needed again, demanding money. This half-century crisis undermined the very foundations of Roman statehood. The authority of the central government collapsed. Trust in the law and in the institution of the emperor itself was completely lost. Ordinary people did not know whom to obey and who would protect them from barbarians or tax collectors. The empire ultimately survived, largely thanks to Diocletian's reforms. But it was never the same again, having received a fatal blow from within. Do you think a state in which soldiers were valued more than farmers could survive in the long run? But the army needed more than just gold to appease it. It needed to be fed. And it was food that became the biggest problem in the 3rd century. Money had lost its value, and civil wars had destroyed logistics. In the next chapter, we will talk about how the main pillar of the empire, the food supply system, collapsed. I will reveal the best-kept secret of Roman stability, which ultimately became its curse. It was not the legions, but the annona system, the free distribution of bread to the population of Rome. As long as the people had bread, they did not revolt. At its peak, the city of Rome consumed an unimaginable amount of food. Hundreds of thousands of citizens received their rations for free. This was the basis of political stability and the popularity of the emperors. This entire gigantic supply system was supported by 2 provinces, Egypt and North Africa. It was from there that huge fleets carried grain to the capital. The empire became hostage to this route. Any disruption in supplies meant more than just food shortages. It meant inevitable hunger riots in the capital. The system was incredibly complex and expensive. It required a huge fleet, warehouses, and officials to keep track of everything. The state spent enormous amounts of money not on development, but simply on feeding the capital. This focus on Rome led to the depletion of other provinces. The peasants of Egypt and Africa were effectively tied to the land. They had to sell grain to the state at fixed prices, which led to their ruin. In 439 AD, disaster struck. The Vandals, having crossed over from Spain, captured Carthage and all of North Africa. Rome lost its main breadbasket in a single day. It was a fatal blow. The annona system collapsed. A real famine began in Rome, which could no longer be stopped. The city's population began to decline rapidly. People fled the capital in search of food. The Eternal City, once the center of the world, turned into a deserted and hungry metropolis. The system created to pacify the masses turned them into hostages. When supplies stopped, the city of Rome, the heart of the empire, began to rapidly empty. It was a collapse caused not by the sword, but by logistics. Guess how long it took to devalue the empire's main currency? The answer is shocking. Just a few decades. Economic collapse was another nail in Rome's coffin. During that chaotic period, the throne was extremely unstable, and each new barracks emperor was kept in power only by the mercy of the legions. Enormous sums of money were required to buy their loyalty. There was a constant shortage of money in the treasury, and the army demanded its share immediately. Instead of reforming taxes or cutting spending, rulers chose the quickest and most destructive path. They essentially launched the printing press of antiquity. They began mixing more and more cheap copper into the silver denarius, once the pride of Rome, in order to mint more coins from the same amount of silver. The currency's degradation was rapid. Under Augustus, the denarius was still a standard coin containing almost 100% silver. But by the middle of the 3rd century, at the height of the crisis, the coin had become a fiction. The precious metal content fell to a paltry 2 to 5%. Formally, it was still called a denarius, but in fact it was just a copper disc. It was only lightly coated with silver to create the appearance of value. But this deception was quickly exposed. Ordinary people and merchants were not economists, but they could clearly see the deception. There were more and more coins, but they could buy less and less. Trust in money disappeared before the eyes of a single generation. This led to a phenomenon that we now call hyperinflation. Prices for basic products, such as grain or oil, skyrocketed tenfold, then 100-fold. The cost of goods fixed yesterday meant nothing today. The irony was that the first to suffer were those for whom it was all intended: the soldiers. Their salaries, although growing in numbers, were in fact turning to dust. They rebelled and demanded payment not in gold, but in kind. Peasants and artisans also stopped accepting this money. Why give away real goods, such as grain or boots, in exchange for useless copper coins? Domestic trade, the lifeblood of the empire, was paralyzed. Rome's complex financial system, built up over centuries, collapsed. Money ceased to perform its main function, to be a measure of value. Complete economic chaos ensued. The empire was thrown back hundreds of years to primitive barter. The shoemaker exchanged shoes for a sack of flour from the miller. The landowner paid his workers not with coins, but with a share of the harvest. This was extremely inconvenient and hampered all economic activity. At some point, the government itself admitted defeat. The Roman state officially refused to accept its own coins, which it had ruined, for tax payments. This was an act of complete distrust of its own financial system. The so-called annona was introduced, a tax in kind. Peasants were required to pay grain, artisans, weapons or clothing, and winemakers. Wine. This system was cumbersome, difficult to administer, and destroyed incentives for production. Since taxes were collected in kind, salaries were also paid in kind. Legionnaires on the border were supplied with rations of grain, wine, and cloth. Officials in the cities received their rations from warehouses. This cumbersome distribution system was called annona militaris for the army. It required a huge bureaucratic apparatus to collect, store, and distribute goods. The bureaucracy swelled to incredible proportions in an attempt to account for every sack of grain. Naturally, theft flourished at every stage. Officials who controlled real assets rather than devalued coins made huge fortunes from this. At the end of the 3rd century, Emperor Diocletian attempted to curb the chaos by force. He issued the famous Edict on Maximum Prices. This law set strict price limits on literally everything, from wheat to the services of a lawyer, and the penalty for exceeding them was death. But the economy cannot be fixed by decree. The result was predictable and catastrophic. It became unprofitable for merchants to sell goods at reduced prices, and they simply disappeared from the official markets. All trade instantly went underground to the black market, where prices became even higher. Although Diocletian and Constantine managed to temporarily stabilize the empire, the economic foundation was destroyed. Confidence in money was undermined forever, and barter became the norm. The Edict on Prices had to be repealed in the end, as it only exacerbated the situation and led to famine in the cities. It was never possible to fully restore monetary circulation. Ultimately, it was this financial collapse that sealed the fate of the West. The Western Roman Empire simply did not have the money to pay its soldiers and hire new legions. The army, for which the coin had been debased, was ultimately left without a means of subsistence. What does the complete devaluation of money lead to? When money ceased to mean anything, The only currency left was power, and there were people in Rome who traded that power wholesale. In the next chapter, you will learn how the emperor's guards sold the empire itself at auction. One of the most shameful pages in the history of Rome was the activity of the Praetorian Guard. These were elite troops created to protect the emperor. In practice, they became the main threat to his life. The Praetorians were stationed in Rome itself. Unlike the legions on the borders, they were at the center of political life. They quickly realized that whoever controlled the capital controlled the emperor. Their appetites grew with each passing year. They demanded constant monetary gifts from the emperors. If the emperor hesitated or tried to restore order, they simply eliminated him. This process culminated in 193 AD. The Praetorians killed Emperor Pertinax, who had attempted to curtail their privileges. After that, they did the unthinkable. The guards announced that the emperor's throne was for sale. They held a real auction. The contenders had to stand outside the walls of their camp and shout out the amounts they would pay each soldier if they came to power. The winner of this shameful auction was a wealthy senator named Didius Julianus. He promised each guard a fabulous sum. The Praetorians proclaimed him emperor and forced the Senate to approve this decision. This episode marked the lowest point of moral decay. The very institution of imperial power was sold for money. The title once held by Augustus and Trajan could now be bought by any rich man. Of course, the reign of Didius Julianus was short-lived. The legions on the borders were outraged by the behavior of the guard. The commander Septimius Severus moved his troops on Rome, executed Julian, and disbanded the Praetorian Guard. However, the very fact of this auction showed how deeply corruption had penetrated the very heart of power. The Praetorians, called upon to be the pillars of the throne, became its chief traitors. This episode showed that nothing was sacred in Rome anymore. The title of emperor, once divine, could now simply be bought. Corruption had reached its peak, eating away at the very core of power. This is what happens behind the closed doors of palaces. Rome's most dangerous traitors wore Roman togas, not barbarian skins. We are talking about the late Roman generals who concentrated enormous, almost unlimited power in their hands. These men determined the fate of the throne, commanding all the armies. They became more important than the emperors they supposedly protected. In the 4th and 5th centuries, the emperors of the West were often weak puppet figures. They ascended the throne at a young age or simply lacked the talent to rule. Their names are almost forgotten today, unlike the names of their generals. Real power was in the hands of the commanders-in-chief, who bore the title Magister Militum, meaning master of soldiers. These men, often of barbarian origin themselves, were the gray cardinals of the empire. They decided matters of war and peace and removed officials from office. A striking example of such a figure is Flavius Stilicho. He was of Vandal origin, but thanks to his outstanding talents, he rose to the highest military rank in the empire. Before his death, Emperor Theodosius entrusted Stilicho with the guardianship of his sons. As a result, Stilicho became the de facto ruler of the Western Empire under the weak and indecisive Emperor Honorius. Honorius preferred to sit safely in Ravenna, while Stilicho fought for him. Stilicho was indeed a brilliant commander. He repeatedly repelled massive barbarian invasions. His main problem was the Goths, led by their ambitious king Alaric. Several times Stilicho literally cornered Alaric, but he preferred to negotiate rather than destroy. He saw the Goths as a valuable resource for replenishing the army. However, his successes and his barbarian origins aroused wild envy and suspicion at the Roman court. As a result, the court intriguers gathered around the emperor hatched a conspiracy. They convinced Honorius that Stilicho himself was aiming for the throne. Allegedly, he wanted to make his own son emperor. The conspiracy was led by an official named Olympius. In 408, Stilicho was falsely accused of treason, arrested, and hastily executed. Rome voluntarily deprived itself of its best and, in fact, only competent defender. The result of this betrayal was not long in coming. The army, deprived of its charismatic leader, was demoralized. Alaric, no longer held back by anyone, was given complete freedom of action. Just 2 years later, in 410, the Goths approached the walls of the capital. After a short siege, the Eternal City fell. The sacking of Rome by the barbarians shocked the entire ancient world and became a true symbol of the beginning of the end. Another tragic example is Flavius Aetius. He was often called the last true Roman, for his loyalty and outstanding military talents. He was also a brilliant strategist and skilled diplomat. His main achievement was the famous Battle of the Catalonian Fields in 451. Aetius managed to assemble an incredible coalition of Romans, Visigoths, and other barbarian tribes. Together, they stopped the invincible Attila and his hordes of Huns, saving Gaul from ruin. It would seem that Aetius was the savior of the empire, deserving eternal gratitude. But Emperor Valentinian III was a petty and envious man. He was terrified of his general's growing influence and enormous popularity. The emperor decided that Aetius had become too powerful and could seize power at any moment. In 454, during a routine audience at the palace, Valentinian personally drew his sword and killed the unarmed Aetius. It was an act of suicidal paranoia. Revenge was not long in coming. Just a year later, in 455, Valentinian himself was killed by 2 soldiers from Aetius's personal guard. They boldly avenged their beloved commander. With the deaths of Aetius and Valentinian, complete chaos reigned in the empire. There was no strong general left, nor a legitimate emperor. The Vandals immediately took advantage of this, sailing from Africa in 455 and plundering Rome even more terribly than the Goths had done. These internal betrayals and constant palace intrigues were worse than any external enemy. The state itself, with its own hands, destroyed its best defenders. The reason was the emperor's paranoia and blind struggle for momentary power. What happens when a state stops trusting its most successful defenders? These internal strife tore apart the Western Empire, but at the same time its eastern half was thriving. In the next chapter, we will examine why the empire split and why only one part of it survived. In 395 AD, the Roman Empire was finally divided into 2 parts, Western and Eastern. This decision was not sudden, but the result of a long process. Already in the 3rd century, Emperor Diocletian introduced a system of 4 rulers, realizing that one man could not cope. Emperor Theodosius the Great's decision to divide the empire between his sons, Arcadius and Honorius, was only a formal confirmation of this split. This split is often cited as one of the main fundamental reasons for the fall. It proved fatal for the western part. The 2 halves of the vast empire ceased to feel like a single entity. Instead of helping each other in the face of a common barbarian threat, they began to compete. Their economic and political interests diverged too far. The Eastern Roman Empire, centered in Constantinople, was incomparably richer and more stable. It inherited the most developed and densely populated regions of the ancient world. This gave it a huge advantage in the struggle for survival. It controlled the prosperous provinces of Greece, Asia Minor, wealthy Syria, and most importantly, Egypt. Egypt was the breadbasket that fed the capital and the army without interruption. These lands were centers of trade and crafts. That is why the treasury of Constantinople was always full of gold. This provided it with a stable flow of taxes that did not dry up even during wars. With this money, it was possible to hire armies, build a fleet, and buy off enemies. Constantinople itself had an ideal strategic location, chosen with brilliant foresight. The city stood at the crossroads of trade routes from Europe to Asia. It controlled the key Bosphorus Strait. Thanks to the mighty walls of Theodosius, which covered it from the land and the sea on 3 other sides, it was virtually impossible to take by storm. For almost 1,000 years, no one could break through these defenses. Its proximity to the rich eastern markets ensured a steady flow of goods and duties. While Western Europe was plunging into chaos, Constantinople remained a shining center of civilization, trade, and diplomacy. The Western Roman Empire, whose capital had moved from Rome to Milan and then to the marshy Ravenna due to threats, was in a much worse position. It was left with problematic, less developed territories. Its provinces, Gaul, Spain, Britain, and North Africa, were poorer than those in the east. They were vast but less urbanized. Their main problem was their constant vulnerability to external enemies. It was these provinces that bore the brunt of the Great Migration. They were constantly subjected to devastating raids by barbarian tribes. Cities were deserted and fields remained uncultivated, leading to a decline in tax revenues. One of the main strategic problems of the West was its borders. They were incredibly long and for the most part ran along land. There were almost no natural barriers, such as those around Constantinople. The vast river borders along the Rhine and Danube required the constant presence of colossal armies. These rivers ceased to be a barrier and became a passageway for Germanic tribes fleeing the Huns. Holding this front consumed absolutely all of the meager resources that the Western Empire still had. There was not enough money for anything except desperate defense. The entire economy was geared toward war. When the great invasions hit the empire in the early 5th century, the East and West acted separately. There was no longer a unified command or common strategy. Everyone saved themselves as best they could. Constantinople often used its treasury and diplomacy to simply buy off the barbarians. The Eastern emperors paid the leaders huge amounts of gold. It was cheaper than fighting them. Byzantine diplomats often directly directed these hordes to the West. This is what happened, for example, with Alaric's Goths. Having received compensation and land in the Balkans, they nevertheless set out to plunder defenseless Italy, which led to the capture of Rome in 410. Over time, the Eastern Empire began to look at the West with outright arrogance. Constantinople considered itself the true, only Rome, the guardian of imperial tradition. The West, on the other hand, was seen as a wild, barbarized outskirt. They preserved Roman law, but in terms of culture and language, they became increasingly Greek. They considered themselves the center of the world. They cared little, if at all, about the problems of the West. Constantinople was in no hurry to help its poor sister, even when she begged for help. They preferred to solve their own problems, such as waging centuries-long wars with Persia in the East. Saving Rome was not their priority. By the middle of the 5th century, the West simply did not have the resources to survive. It ran out of money and people to maintain its defenses. The financial system never recovered from the crisis of the 3rd century. The economy was completely destroyed by hyperinflation and unbearable taxes, which were collected in kind. Peasants fled or sought protection from barbarian chiefs themselves in order to avoid paying Roman tax collectors. The army was chronically understaffed. Roman citizens were no longer available for service, so the legions increasingly consisted of barbarian mercenaries. These federates were unreliable and could betray their masters at any moment. While the East was entering its golden age and flourishing, the West was slowly and painfully dying. The contrast between the two halves of the once united empire was striking. One capital was building temples, while the other was hiding behind swamps. The Eastern Empire, which historians would call Byzantium, demonstrated incredible resilience. It was able to adapt, maintain a strong army, navy, and, most importantly, a functioning economy. It outlived the Western Empire by almost 1,000 years. Its end came only in 1453 under the blows of the Ottoman Turks. This proves how much more successful and stable the eastern part was. By 476, the Western Empire had essentially been abandoned to its fate. It was a mere shadow of its former glory, controlling only Italy. All the other provinces had already established their own barbarian kingdoms. It had neither the money nor the people to defend even these vast borders. The emperors in Ravenna were mere puppets in the hands of the barbarian warlords who commanded the remnants of the army. Eastern Rome, which became Byzantium, chose to save itself and watch the agony from the sidelines. But how exactly did the formal end come about? In the next chapter, we will talk about the last Roman emperor and the date that went down in history forever. What happens to an army when citizens do not want to serve in it? It was this question that proved fatal for Rome. Its legion, once an invincible machine, had changed beyond recognition by the 5th century. It had been barbarized from within. This transformation was not rapid. It took place gradually over decades. Little remained of the former glory of the disciplined and patriotic legions. As a result, the army that had created the empire became one of the reasons for its demise. Gone were the days when the legions consisted of Italian peasants defending their land. In the Republican era and during the early empire, military service was an honorable duty and a social ladder. But by the 4th century, everything had changed. In the late empire, Roman citizens, especially in the wealthy and urbanized provinces, did everything they could to avoid military service. They saw neither honor nor meaning in it. Service on the frontier was hard, dangerous, and poorly paid. Townspeople and landowners preferred to engage in trade or manage their estates. They were willing to do anything to avoid wearing a military uniform. The practice of self-mutilation even became widespread, with young men crippling themselves to become unfit for service. As a result, the government gave in and introduced a special tax. It was possible to legally buy oneself out of conscription by paying a certain amount to the treasury. The government had to hire someone else with this money. But the empire's borders were bursting at the seams under the pressure of the Great Migration. The army needed to be replenished, and the influx of Roman recruits had dried up. No place stays empty for long, and Rome found what it thought was a simple solution. It began to massively recruit those it had previously fought against, the barbarians. At first, these were individual mercenaries or small detachments of Germans and Sarmatians. They served for hard cash in the so-called auxiliary units. But as the demographic and military crisis deepened, this practice became widespread. Rome moved from recruiting individual soldiers to hiring entire tribes. Tens of thousands of warriors, along with their families and leaders, were accepted into service. This system was officially called foederati. It was based on a legal agreement, which in Latin was called fidus. It was no longer just a contract with a mercenary, but an international agreement with an entire people. The Roman government concluded such agreements with barbarian tribes such as the Goths, Franks, or Burgundians. The emperor acted as the supreme protector. The tribe received the status of ally of the Roman people. Under the terms of the treaty, the tribe received vast lands for settlement within the empire. These were often deserted border areas in Gaul or the Balkans. The barbarians became, in essence, military settlers. In addition to land, they were regularly paid huge subsidies in gold. They were also supplied with food from imperial warehouses. This was payment for their loyalty and military services. In exchange for these generous gifts, the tribe was obliged to perform military service. It had to provide contingents of soldiers to defend the borders. Emperors also often used them in civil wars against their rivals. A key feature of this system was that the federates did not become Romans. They did not fight as part of the regular legions, but as separate, autonomous allied units. They did not undergo Roman training and were not subject to Roman discipline. These warriors remained loyal first and foremost to their own leaders, or kings. They fought under their personal command. They did not wear Roman uniforms, did not know Latin, and retained their Germanic customs and battle tactics. What did this mean in practice? Essentially, Rome hired some barbarians to defend against other barbarians. The Franks fought against the Alemanni, and the Goths against the Huns. The Roman commander Aetius won the battle against Attila precisely because of his army of federates. At first glance, this system seemed very advantageous. It was simply cheaper than training, equipping, and maintaining a regular professional Roman army. There was no need to spend years training recruits. The barbarians were natural-born warriors, ready to fight here and now. The empire received a ready-made army simply by paying with gold. But these savings were a time bomb planted under the very foundation of the state. The main problem was that the federates' loyalty was extremely low. They felt no patriotism or attachment to the Roman state. Roman culture and laws were alien and indifferent to them. They did not serve an abstract empire or a faceless emperor somewhere in Ravenna. They served those who paid them gold and gave them land. Their loyalty was personal and bought with money. As soon as payments ceased for any reason, which happened often given the West's leaky budget, they instantly turned from defenders into enemies. Their weapons were immediately turned against their former masters. They began to plunder the very provinces they were supposed to defend. They demanded higher salaries or better lands, backing up their demands with force. It was pure blackmail, which a weakened Rome could not resist. The most classic example is the leader of the Visigoths, Alaric. He was not just a savage barbarian who came from beyond the Danube. Alaric served Rome for a long time and even held the high Roman military rank of Magister Armatae. He commanded the Gothic Federate troops and fought for Emperor Theodosius. His famous march on Rome in 410 began not as an invasion, but as a mercenary revolt. He rebelled because he and his Goths felt they had been underpaid. Emperor Honorius and his court in Ravenna refused to meet Alaric's demands for land and gold. The offended leader led his army to plunder Italy, which ended in the tragic fall of the Eternal City. And this was not an isolated case. This practice went so far that by the middle of the 5th century, the army of the Western Roman Empire consisted almost entirely of Germans. There were almost no real Italians or Gauls left in it. The army ceased to be Roman in its composition. Not only the soldiers were barbarians, but also the entire high command. The commanders who actually ruled the empire, such as Stilicho, Aetius, and Ricimer, were themselves of barbarian or semi-barbarian origin. A terrible thing happened. The Romans as a nation completely forgot how to fight. They shifted the function of defending the state onto the shoulders of mercenaries. They became fatally dependent on those whom they despised, but without whom they could no longer do without. As a result, Rome found itself in a paradoxical and humiliating situation. It became a hostage to its own defenders. The empire paid huge sums of money to barbarians to protect it from other barbarians. The army was no longer Roman in spirit or composition. It had turned into a conglomerate of barbarian gangs loyal only to their leaders. These leaders became the real rulers of the West, placing puppet emperors on the throne and deposing them. At the decisive moment, these defenders simply chose their own interests. They realized that they no longer needed even the ghost of Roman power. In 476, the barbarian commander Odoacer simply deposed the last emperor, deciding that he would now rule himself. The fall of the empire took place not only in the barracks, but also in the minds of the people. By the 5th century, the very concept of Roman citizen had lost all value. An era of total apathy had begun. The reason for this was the monstrous tax system. In order to maintain the army and the bloated bureaucratic apparatus, the state squeezed every last drop out of the population. The taxes were unbearable. The curiales, the middle class, members of city councils, suffered particularly. They were personally responsible for collecting taxes in their cities. If they could not collect the required amount, they had to pay out of their own pockets. This led to the mass impoverishment of the middle class. People fled the cities, abandoning their property. They preferred to become vagrants or even seek the protection of barbarians just to avoid paying Roman taxes. Peasants also fled their lands. They went to large landowners, the magnates. These magnates lived in fortified villas, had their own private armies, and were not subject to imperial officials. This is how feudalism began. The empire was breaking up into isolated enclaves. The central government was losing control of the country. Ordinary people did not see the empire as a protector. They saw it only as a tax collector. In many regions of Gaul and Spain, the population welcomed the barbarians as liberators. The traditional date of the fall of Rome is 476 AD. In that year, the barbarian commander Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor. Ironically, his name was Romulus Augustulus. This name was symbolic. Romulus was the founder of Rome, and Augustus was the first emperor. The last emperor bore the name Little Romulus, Little Augustus, which emphasized his insignificance. Romulus Augustulus was about 16 years old. He was a puppet in the hands of his father, the commander Orestes. Real power had long belonged to the barbarian mercenaries who made up the army. In 476, these mercenaries rebelled. They demanded that Orestes give them a third of all the land in Italy. Orestes refused. Then the leader of the mercenaries, Odoacer, killed Orestes. He entered the capital, Ravenna, and simply deposed the young emperor. They spared his life and sent him into exile on an estate with a good pension. The most interesting thing is what Odoacer did next. He did not proclaim himself emperor, nor did he appoint a new puppet emperor. He convened the Roman Senate. The senators wrote an official letter to the emperor in Constantinople. The letter stated that the West no longer needed its own emperor, and that one emperor for the entire empire in Constantinople would suffice. Odoacer sent the imperial regalia, the diadem and purple mantle, to the east. It was a symbolic gesture. The Western Roman Empire officially ceased to exist. For contemporaries, this event went almost unnoticed. Barbarian chiefs had long ruled Rome. The lives of ordinary people did not change in any way. There was no great battle, no end of the world. The empire simply faded away quietly, like a candle burning out. The internal decay that had lasted 300 years had finally come to an end. We can see that the Roman Empire did not collapse overnight. It was a slow and painful process of internal decay. Corruption, economic chaos, famine, and internal betrayals destroyed it long before the last barbarian entered the Eternal City. A system built on conquest could not survive in peace. The legions created for defense became its executioners, and an economy based on slavery and taxes simply could not bear its own weight. The history of Rome is an eternal warning that any system, even the most powerful, is vulnerable from within. What other hidden reasons for the fall of great empires would you like to discuss? Suggest topics for future videos in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next studies.